Welcome to our webinar on experiential learning. We're going to have a panel discussion on using management simulations to promote experiential learning. We've got some great guest speakers from University of Sunderland, London, and also Glasgow, Caledonian University. And I'll just go through some housekeeping notes before we get started for real. So just to say, I'm Leon Lloyd. I'm actually the Business Development Manager with Edumundo. And I'm also joined by my co-host, Milo Hendricks, who's our director. We will be recording the webinar. In fact, we're already recording it. And this is partly to serve as a reminder for any who want to sort of recap, but also we know that a lot of people register for these webinars and then can't make it for whatever reason. So we'll be making sure we send a link to everyone as well. To make it run smoothly, we have made sure that everyone's microphones are muted and cameras are off. Having said that, we will be having a breakout session throughout at some point in the simulation. So that will be hopefully around 11:30, we'll be doing that. So within the breakout rooms, to be clear, we won't be recording the breakout rooms. So in the breakout rooms, feel free to turn your microphones on and your cameras and participate and ask questions to our guest speakers. In the meantime, in this main session, please feel free to ask questions using the chat function. Milo will be monitoring the chat and trying to interrupt us as we're talking with any appropriate questions. So if you have more questions afterwards, well, please feel free to reply to one of the webinar emails which our colleague Callum has sent you, or you can get in touch with me at any time at leon.l@edumundo.co.uk. So just to say our speakers today, we're really grateful to our guest speakers. We've got Alessandro Ferrazza at University of Sunderland in London, who's a lecturer in postgraduate business management and actually also sort of works on the MBA there, as well as in the hospitality management as well. And we're joined by Dr. Keith Halcro, who's Senior Lecturer in Management and Director of the University's Professional Doctorate Suite at Glasgow, Caledonian University. So we'll be talking in great depth about everything to do with experiential learning and management simulations in due course. So really looking forward to today's session, and yeah, really grateful for everyone, for all our participants for joining. I'm sure we'll have a few late joiners who are joining us as we go along as well. So a little bit about the schedule for today. Well, I'm going to hand over in a few moments to my colleague, Milo, who's just going to give a quick word about Edumundo, our background, and a little bit about what management simulations are. So I know that a lot of people joining these webinars are perhaps new to management simulations, don't perhaps have a huge amount of experience with them. And so it's perhaps useful to provide a bit of context in terms of how they work generally and what it's all about. Then we'll be going in at 10 minutes after that, at 10 to 11, on the actual panel discussion itself, which will be making up the bulk of today's session. And then hopefully, if we're keeping to time, we'll be breaking out into breakout rooms around 11:30. Within those, we'll do a very short demonstration of the management simulations. And also we'll be giving you a chance to ask questions directly to the speakers. So after that, we'll come back. Perhaps we'll share a little bit of the themes which we discussed in the breakout rooms and a sort of general summary. And hopefully we'll be all done by noon or maybe a little bit before. We'll have to see how it goes. So without further ado, Milo, handing over the floor to you.
Thank you, Leon, and welcome everyone. Great to see you here. I noticed a couple of people we know, we work with. Great to have you here. I will try to keep it as short as possible. Just a couple of slides, 2 or 3 slides from my side to, to say hello, of course, but also to give you a little bit of background of the products used by our keynote speakers in the panel discussion. So at least you know a little bit about what they're talking about. One slide about the company. Edumundo was founded a little bit over 20 years ago. As you can hear from my funny accent, we're based in the Netherlands. Having said that, we have a couple of great colleagues living in the UK, but also in the Middle East. And we're working with universities across a whole lot of different countries. So don't let the accent fool you, so to say. Our management simulations are used by over 300 universities worldwide, including a whole bunch of triple accredited ones, for example, business schools, but also used by larger companies in industry to train their staff or to recruit staff. So we work, for example, with Deloitte, with PwC, with a couple of banks as well, who are using our management simulations. And as you see over here, we serve over 40,000 students a year. I think it's even more now because we're growing so quickly these days. So, oh, next slide, please. Yeah, so this is some key points about how the management simulations work. So first of all, they're all web-based. So that means that students can always use it on any device from any location in the world, on their tablets, their laptops, their desktops, and even their mobile phones. Although that's a bit small, but it still works. What we do, if you have a group of students, we will split them into teams of about 4 students per team, and each team will manage their own company. And depending on what kind of module subject you have and student level, this could be, for example, that they are managing a smartphone company or a chocolate factory, or they trade in sports equipment, or they manage a jeans brand if it's about marketing. So there's a whole range of different management simulations, so different industries and subject focuses we offer. It's always played in rounds, and 1 round stands for a year of operations. And most often what we see is that the management simulations are played over the length of a, let's say, 10-week module. In that case, students will manage their companies, for example, for 8 weeks, which stands for 8 years of operations. Having said that, for some of the executive MBAs or residential sessions, these simulations can also be played in 1 or 2 days in a sort of a pressure cooker system. Therefore, the time investment is flexible as well. Important to know also is that it's very interactive. So one team's decisions will influence the other team's results. So they are really direct competitors of each other. So you can imagine they will be fighting over market share. So it's war in the classroom, so to say, and that it's important to understand that it's really fun because of that, and the fun factor and the engagement which comes with that increases their learning curve. So it's really about applying the theory. It's about the fun way of learning, and it's really in line with the newest generation of students who have played video games all their lives so far. You know, they want to have something better than just reading a book if they learn. And my final slide, Leon, please. So this is a quick overview of our portfolio of management simulations. I won't discuss all of them, but what you'll see here is we're covering almost all business subjects, from strategy, ops management, international business, emerging markets, marketing, management accounting. But today, both of our keynote speakers from Glasgow and Sunderland have been using a couple of these management simulations, but lately they've both started using phone ventures, the first one you see on this slide. In that particular simulation, students are managing their own globally operating smartphone companies, such as Apple or Samsung. I have to say it's one of our flagship simulations, really proud of it. And we're happy to give you a brief demo in the breakout rooms, after which we will have, you have some chances to ask all your questions to the keynote speakers. Over to you, Leon.
That's great. Thanks for that, Milo. And yeah, as I say, it's really useful just, I think, for those who perhaps haven't had much experience in using management simulations, just to have that little bit of an overview in terms of what we're talking about today, a bit of context, really. So without further ado, let's get our speakers involved, and I'll stop sharing these slides a second. So welcome to Keith and welcome to Alex. How are you both doing?
Very well, thanks, Leon, and thank you for the invite to come and present and talk to colleagues about Edumundo's products and our experiences of what it's meant for students and what it's meant for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for inviting us, and I'm pleased to be here representing not only the university but also the art of the possible using Edumundo's products. No,
that's great, and I know, yeah, both using Phone Ventures simulation, which Milo has just introduced as well, talking about that. And well, I know you're both using them slightly differently. So Keith, I think on undergraduate, and
yes.
Alex at postgraduate MBA. But well, perhaps before we start getting into that, maybe if you just give us a little bit of background, if you like, just to introduce yourselves and perhaps how long you've been using simulations for and how long you've been in academia, perhaps. Keith, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yes, I've been lecturing for quite a few years now. I have been using simulation games for about a decade, both with postgraduates and undergraduates, although currently I'm using it with undergraduates on a large module for about 400 students in Glasgow. I also use it in Mauritius and Oman for overseas partners that we have there as well. So it's interesting to see how it works both in Glasgow, but also the feedback and observations of its use overseas. My route into using management simulation has, because we're an applied university, all our students are working or have worked, and therefore they find management simulation games something that they can easily relate to, because it allows them to bring in ideas from their own working experiences. And as we've gone through it over the years, we've come to understand the games better. And I think what we're doing is we're constantly enhancing the experience for students. And I'm happy to share, you know, some of the triumphs we've had, but also to be quite candid, there have been things that we've learned from our errors.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. And well, yeah, looking forward to getting into all of that today. So, and Alex, just a bit about you.
Well, I've been in academia now since 2019. Prior to that, I was working for a global organization as a director, working across Europe, but mostly in the UK. The one thing about working in academia and using the gamification element of it is that additional stimulus for the students that has given me the opportunity of stimulating them into you know, things like problem solving and all that kind of stuff. So it's a great tool to use for me. I use it for postgraduate mostly. And at the university, we are just introduced it for undergraduates as well, but not that particular model, but we're using a different product from yourselves, really.
That's the tourism management one, isn't it?
Correct.
Yes.
And
that's really exciting. I think we're looking forward to sort of doing more with that one over the coming year as well. Okay, well, as you know, this webinar's on experiential learning, and I just wanted to sort of say that actually it's nothing new, really, experiential learning. It's been around for years. But having said that, it does seem like it's still considered a little bit of an innovative way to deliver the learning. And I suppose contrary to sort of didactic, traditional teaching methods, which are quite passive from the learner perspective of receiving information, experiential learning, of course, is going the other way, and it's actually trying to it's making a more active approach. You're getting students more involved in the learning. But well, Keith, perhaps put it to you first. I mean, what's your view on experiential learning, and why is it so important?
I should sort of flag up that actually my first degree was history, and that was very didactic. And I certainly found from my experiences, whilst my lecturers were good, it didn't really engage the students. So I was slightly swayed to this idea already of trying to build in the students' own experiences to their learning processes and success. As I said a few minutes ago, we're a post-92 university. For those of you outside the UK, post-92s are what used to be called polytechnics, very heavily vocationally orientated. And the type of student that we recruit at Glasgow Caledonian is they are working either currently part-time or have been working. And therefore for them to be able to apply learning tools that can draw on their own experiences is absolutely invaluable in helping them understand deeper theoretical concepts. And the feedback we get from students is, I now understand how theory and practice interrelate. Before, we were tending to be taught simply by the lecturer, And that doesn't really help us to understand why we're learning. And if we're looking at this idea of lifelong learning, as students will continue to learn through the next 50, 60 plus years of their experience, of their life, it is important that we constantly try to root theoretical knowledge, I believe, within the paradigm of the individual's experiences. Our job as lecturers, in a sense, as facilitators, trying to help the students make that connection. Because once the student makes that connection, the learning is much deeper. And they can then start to transport that knowledge to other settings. It is, just going back to your observation, Leon, that it is strange that so much of higher education seems to be the lecturer lecturing at the student rather than trying to enable the students. It does seem puzzling even now in the 21st century in 2021. If we're looking at wider issues of student retention, student employability, I think experiential learning is an invaluable way of encouraging students to learn and to engage with their learning, because it makes it much more understandable. Education has to be understandable to be worthwhile.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think for me, and well, for those of us who are sort of very heavily involved in using simulations or other forms of experiential learning, I think it's easy to forget actually that this is still considered innovative. It's not just it's not a given now that this is how students learn. But I think perhaps more and more that's the way we're headed. And well, Alex, any thoughts about that from you?
Well, I'd like to resonate what Keith is saying, because I remember my first degree being extremely didactic. And we were, as students, we were spoken to rather than involved in the lessons themselves. We were given huge volumes to learn and to read, but there was no real interaction. Now, the modern style of teaching is literally introducing flipped classrooms and much more of a problem solving and peer learning, which is very much based on personal experience, and therefore this gamification does help incredibly in developing that in the students. I find personally that the use of these products not only helps the lecturer in facilitating the delivery of the theoretical elements of the module, but also is for the students to put that into practice, and how applying that theory to practice actually does create changes, and those changes interact with the other teams, and the other teams actually have to amend those strategies and that they have learned in the lessons. So it makes the whole learning process very active, and the feedback that I've had from students is amazing, really. So
could I maybe just pick up on one of the points that Alec has just made about peer learning? I think that's very important, that experiential learning, I think, enables students not only to learn from the lecturer, but it also allows them to draw on their the knowledge and experience of their classmates and triangulate that knowledge. I think with a didactic approach, one tends to assume the lecturer knows everything and is the font of all knowledge. But if you have peers offering their observations and experiences of their own working lives, then it allows the student to challenge perhaps some of the lecturer's thinking or some of the theories thinking and counter it against what they've observed. And so I think experiential learning is not just simply the lecturer being involved in the learning process and the individual student, but it is the wider community engaged in the learning process for the benefit of the individual.
No, that's really important, isn't it? The social aspects of learning through doing. That's a sort of integral part, I think, of experiential learning. And actually, what you're talking about there as well is the role of the lecturer as the facilitator of the learning, isn't it? Rather than the disseminator of information, it's facilitating and giving the opportunity for students to learn for themselves and take control. And that's that whole student-led piece, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, certainly, as you look at work by Lave and Wenger, there's a lot about this idea of community practice, particularly for people that have been engaged or are currently working. I use it a lot with professional doctorate students, but I would argue it resonates for anyone in higher education and can actually work down into the colleges as well, and maybe even in 6 years of school.
Alex, you mentioned flipped classroom or flipped learning a little bit, and I don't know if it's fair to say that perhaps, well, from a sort of outside observation, I'm not someone who lectures, but it seems to me that perhaps, given the last year and a half with the sort of forced transition into online and blended more so, perhaps now there's a bit more of a push for flipped learning, because maybe it's easier with the fact that lectures are invariably being recorded now. And I think even as we transition back into campus, I think it seems that those big lecture theatres are still going to remain largely that those lectures are largely going to remain online. So maybe that also helps push to sort of more of a flipped learning approach by getting students to perhaps watch the lecture material beforehand and then come and have that face-to-face time in the tutorials to be more sort of go into deeper learning and actually talk about things and ask questions. What are your thoughts about that? And actually, I suppose beyond that, then thinking about simulations and how they support the flipped learning approach.
Well, I think the flipped learning approach is one of those ways of engaging with the students and the students engaging with the lecturer that is creating that new bubble of learning, so that the students aren't necessarily asking the question based on the lecture, but they're creating the questions to create the lecture and therefore stimulate the answers from their peers. And that has sort of helped the learning process with the whole class. Now, you're right, when we talk about those large lecture theatres, they're not going to be I guess is not going to be the immediate future again. But and the students feel that they want to be engaged with the lecturer and the other students. It was only last week in one of my last lectures before the summer recess that one of the students asked me during the lecture, well, would you want me to? I'm a HR manager in one of in my current role. Can I take some of the delivery of the lecture for the next week? So we organized that, and that created a completely new level of learning for the students, because they were learning from someone who is a peer to them, but also a professional in their field. And that created a whole host of conversations and discussions beyond that, which was great to see. And but also it was a new experience for the students themselves, and it worked really, really well. And I think that is going to be the future. I mean, I find it quite enlightening, but also easier for me with postgraduates, because most of my students are professionals in business. So in their fields, they can bring that experience into the classroom, and that is inevitably a very, very valuable tool. Yeah.
And Keith, from a sort of more of an undergraduate perspective?
Well, I suppose that this enthusiasm for the flipped classroom over the last 5-10 years is maybe partly a response to the concern that a lot of lectures were tending to be talking at the students, and that the information that was being relayed in the lectures could often be acquired through the student reading material and getting the students to then use their time more productively in higher cognitive learning in the form of work in the classroom, which allows them to demonstrate ideas of, decision making, problem solving, etc. And certainly the advocates of the flipped classroom has suggested that this will encourage more engagement and ultimately lead to greater ownership of the individual's own learning. And if you feel you've got ownership of your learning, you will tend to do a better job at it. So there is certainly the last 12, 18 months has encouraged this idea of using the time that we have with students to try and get them to engage in higher level competencies, and encouraging the student instead to focus on pre-reading so that when they come into the computer simulation classes, they can demonstrate that knowledge and they can therefore constructively question the tutor what is going on and why it's going on, both in order to demonstrate their understanding, but also to help illustrate to the tutor gaps in their knowledge. So I think the students find that the idea of the flipped classroom is about getting them to engage, which is more than this kind of passive and didactic learning we were talking about a few minutes ago. I think the whole emphasis of education is constantly trying to remodel itself and to redevelop in order to use technology to create a more engaged learning experience. That's ultimately what we're about, because we know from data and we know from research that an engaged student is not only going to achieve better results for the individual, but will tend to also become a better advert for the university and the wider sector. So I think this constant striving to improve and develop what we do is important. And the flipped classroom has certainly come to the fore over the last, as I said, through COVID, although you could see, plenty of practitioners pre-COVID.
No, but that's great, to hear that the students are engaged and they can also see that as well. They can understand what's happening. Because of course, if you've got engaged students, they're going to do better. They're going to get a better overall experience out of university. And then, of course, go on to do better things, better in graduate outcomes, better survey results for the university and everything. It's interesting though, I think with contact time, because of course, that simulation use there is contact time. If if they're able to sort of talk through with lecturers and ask questions as they're sort of playing within the simulation. But sometimes I feel like there's this perception from students that they've grown up. Their perception of what university is sitting in a lecture theatre and sort of receiving these traditional lectures. And if they don't get that, that's not value for money. But of course, I think there's a bit of a shift now where technology is less now being seen as something which is sort of a way to save money or to take away from the student. And actually, it's something that's really enhancing the learning process as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, is this idea that if we use technology properly, if the sector uses technology properly, it will complement and enhance the learning experience. I think if it's seen as simply a cost-driven process, then I don't think it's going to benefit the universities in the long term. But it's a bit like having a library. The library is there to enhance the individual's learning, and technology should be serving the same purpose. It's about making the students' experiences better, but it's also about better preparing them for their future careers, activities. And it's just another tool. I think that's the important thing for us as academics to realize is technology is a tool to enhance, not a tool to replace.
I totally agree with Keith, totally agree. I mean, we are discovering more and more how technology can help and support the teaching, but also the learning element of it. So it is a tool, and it needs to be used as a tool to support the students, but also to support the lecturers in delivering that message to the students.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose just another thought on that is as well that, technology as well, some staff, some lecturers can perceive technology as a threat sometimes. If it's taking over a role in a certain way that they traditionally would have done themselves, then that can be sort of threatening to a certain degree. But I think more and more now, hopefully, lecturers and senior staff are seeing this as much more of an asset, right? Because if it frees up staff time, then you can concentrate on having more contact time, more valuable contact time with the students, and also more developmental type activities as well around program and module delivery.
Yeah, I think it's on that theme. It's seeing technology as an enabler, and I suppose it reflects, in a sense, maybe this idea that maybe the role of the lecturer. You know, a lot of lecturers have done this for years, so this goes back in time. But the idea that the lecturer is not necessarily lecturing at the student, but the lecturer is facilitating the learning for the student. And I think that's the message I would say to people coming in today, is not necessarily that the technology should be replacing you, but how can it help you to engage the students more and to give them a better experience? And I would argue that if the student gets a better experience, you'll have a more enjoyable experience. And it should, and this is a message that students uniformly have got to try and convey to both staff and students, that technology is an enabler. It's not there as a cost-cutting tool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, also in terms of actually initially embedding that simulation for the first time, perhaps there's a perception that that's going to be an added burden and an extra workload. In reality, that's often not what we find, especially with the support that we can provide to sort of take care of, you know, module mapping, aligning the assessment, aligning the simulation to the module specification and so forth. We can do that very, very seamlessly. But we mentioned engagement already. I'm wondering now if it's perhaps useful to start to look at very tangible perhaps aspects which especially some of those attendees today who are already using simulations can take. So thinking around, a little bit about sort of maybe engagement strategies, what you can do perhaps to make sure that students are engaged whilst using a simulation. So Alex, what about you?
Well, some of the things that I've noticed was coming away from the classroom style of teaching into the sort of either environment, was the fact that students tend to kind of sometimes lose a little bit of focus. So I wanted to ensure that my students were always engaged in the simulation, and to do that, I gave them an opportunity of earning extra points during the each week. And so I give them a specific task to achieve, and I put so many points available to them. With that in mind, I try and stimulate also the creativity, and sometimes I get them to do news articles to introduce into the business, so that the other teams can see that there is a new product coming from them. It could be a marketing element. It could be something that it could be threatening to the other organizations because they come out with a new product for their organization. So that will create the creativity. Sometimes I get them to also do a publicity stunt for their organizations. And one team in particular actually involved the whole of their family, and they created a film. They've uploaded the film, and it was amazing to see how engaged they become as students, even though it's all done online. And so, by doing that, I create them. I create that rivalry between the teams that keeps them fueled throughout the module. I do have some of the games being played at weekends, and I know that we say that we lecture from Monday to Friday and blah blah, but I actually log in on at weekends and do help the students. I mean, not everybody does it, don't have to do it, but they see that I'm involved with them, and that gives them additional inspiration to complete that module in a more successful manner. And through this, with the support of the game, I've noticed that comparing it to past outcomes of this module, not only the submission has increased, but also the final results have improved greatly. with a large majority of the students achieving higher grades at the end of the module, which is really, really quite good.
No, that's really helpful. And I think, just to maybe expand on some of those points a little bit for those attendees who maybe haven't used a simulation or one of our simulations before. So the simulations allow for certain things to be uploaded within them, like you mentioned, press releases, for example, or marketing videos, which, although they're not taken into account by the simulation algorithm per se, they can sort of be built into the simulation and then manually marked, and then we can manually assign points on those teams so that it's also reflected in the ranking list. So yeah, but that sounds like a really good approach, and that's really helpful. And Keith, what about you in terms of sort of engagement strategies?
I think it's important that if you're using simulation games, that you have to set the scene. You have to explain to the students why you're using the simulation games and the benefits that will accrue to the students. So it's arguing about the pluses that come from this, in the sense of, firstly, that students will be able to take their own experiences and apply it to the game. So one of the things, for example, in the game that we use, the Phone Ventures, there are hints, ideas about how can you encourage more motivated staff. So you try and encourage the students to think about their own working experiences, employers that they've enjoyed working for, or maybe employers they've not enjoyed working for, because sometimes the most powerful learning comes from your own failures, your own problems, and try and relate that to the game. So it's very useful getting the students to think about their experiences and telling them not only their own individual experiences, but also hearing the experiences of others will allow them to engage more fully. So it's about making it clear to the students the value to be gained from simulation. It's a, if you like, a safe house in which they can start to replicate some of their own previous experiences and apply them. But it's also about highlighting to the students the knowledge that can be gained from their team members and helping them at that moment in time, but also in their lifelong learning. This is free learning you're getting from your peers. It costs you nothing. Take advantage of your fellow teammates in the nicest possible way, because if you like, in life, a lot of it's you scratch my back and I'll scratch your back, and this is a wonderful way of demonstrating it. I think the other thing I would also highlight to anyone listening in today is it's not just preparing the students, it's about preparing your colleagues. So that if you, I have a team of 7 tutors, so it's about ensuring what the tutors understand why we're using a simulation game and the processes that we're going to follow in using that simulation game, so that they both understand, but also can challenge me, and I suppose by extension challenge Edumundo about some of the thinking and the processes that we use. And that is not only beneficial for them in perhaps using simulation games in their own modules, but it also allows them to feel that they've got more ownership. I think the difficulty for very large modules is that if your teaching team is disengaged from the activities of the module, whether it's the lectures or the assessments, the danger is everyone looks to the module leader for solutions. And then by getting your module team on board with you, it will reduce your workload and I hope make your module team feel happier. So I would say there's kind of 2 elements to the engagement. It's engaging the students, but it's also engaging your module team and ensuring that the simulation game runs as effectively and smoothly as possible. Because if you don't engage your colleagues, you're just going to have students knocking on your door endlessly asking questions that really should be answered by the seminar tutors.
Yeah, okay, so like coming back to the social aspects of learning again, that's making sure that the students know why we're doing the simulation and what's the purpose of it, what they're going to get out of it, and actually really making sure they make the most of their peers. Mm. And on the flip side, with the staff, yes, making sure you've got the buy-in of your team and that the team know what you're doing, what the purpose is. So you've got all angles covered. Sounds like some great tips. You mentioned actually one thing I wanted to draw upon was the fact that some of the best learning points can be from your failures. And I think that's really, really interesting because we often talk about the fact that, and perhaps this pushes us nicely on to talk about assessment, right? Because with assessment strategies within the simulation, of course, there's a ranking list, right? So there's all the teams, they really want to win, and they really want to be top of that ranking list. And that's that competitive spirit, that competitive edge is what's sort of driving the teams forward every week. They want to do as well as possible. But of course, it's not necessarily, you know, the top teams haven't necessarily learned the most. They've done well in the simulation, but actually often we find those teams that come last in the ranking list can have learned the most in the simulation. So I think that's kind of relevant there. Just on that ranking list, we often find that if that is used for assessment purposes, it's normally a relatively small proportion of the overall credit, the overall marks for the module. But how do you both assess your students, and what's the sort of assessment setup like on the modules? Alex, perhaps over to you.
Yeah, well, the actual ranking has no relevance to the assessment criteria at all. The assessment is based on a reflective account of their participation to the module, their leadership learning, the management style, the decision making, making reference to how they supported the rest of the team in achieving a good sort of decision-making process, how these have created opportunities for their organization, but has no relevance to the actual ranking of the team. I have found that you know, even though you know, the students know very well how they are being assessed from week one, it still motivates them to try and achieve more during the game itself. Some of the assessment criteria is try and through the learning how the theory can be applied to practice. So that's what I want to see in the assessment when they're preparing the final assessment for the module, and I can see how they are they become very precise on the application of the theory when they actually have to explain how they created that decision, what model of decision making they've used to achieve that final decision for the team. So that is very useful and very creative from their point of view as well. Over to you.
Okay, we do give a small weighting. We made a conscious decision at the very beginning to award a certain amount of marks to the team's performance in the ranking. We felt that that would help to keep the teams engaged right through to the end. And we certainly find that even if we didn't put the weighting in as part of the assessment, the best students would still be very competitive. We do find a high degree of competitiveness coming out in many teams. We use two assessments. We have a team assessment worth 50%, and we have an individual assessment worth 50%. Of the team assessment, 15% of that relates to the ranking performance. We find that, as I said, helps to keep the students engaged. But we also find there's some kind of humorous competitiveness elements coming through. So we hear students, you know, trying to bribe and blackmail their friends to give them information about what their teams are doing. There was one student a couple of years ago who told me that used to be one of their big conversations with his girlfriend because she was in another team, trying to pump her for information what their team was doing because their team was consistently beating his team. And he suspected that she was giving him duff information. So in a way, it was kind of humorous, but I suppose it relates to some of the practices that go on in the real world. You know, we do use our relationships to try and find out what activities our competitors are doing. And sometimes our competitors are very honest and tell us the truth. And sometimes our competitors feed us false information. So we've certainly found that having the team element and an individual element as the assessment has been very conducive to the learning, because the team element encourages shared knowledge, but the individual element allows the student to reflect on the strategy that the team has pursued, on the team's creation, and on their own individual development as a learner. And I think that's important. You know, if we go back to this idea of experiential learning, it's not simply getting people to relate their experiences and how they relate to the knowledge the tutor or the lecturer is giving them, but it's reflecting on what it really means to them, and whether it's good or bad or relevant knowledge to the individual student. So I think the assessment mix that we have worked on has allowed marks to be driven higher. Intriguingly, and it maybe echoes something that Alex said a few minutes ago, we can statistically show that having used simulation games, that we have on average lifted marks about 1 mark a year for the last 4 years. So in itself, it doesn't sound very much going from, say, a 55 to 56, but cumulatively, we can now statistically show that over the period of the last 4 years, the students who historically were getting 55 are now getting 60 on their team report. And that's important to students, because no matter how much we stress the importance of learning to students who are 18, 20, 25, 30, whatever, students are also driven by what is ultimately their classification grades or their overall average. And this is important to demonstrate to students. One of the advantages of a simulation game is it does seem to lead to better results.
That's really positive, you know, to hear as well. And sorry, Alex, were you going to say something there?
Yeah, I was, whilst Keith was speaking, I remember this on this occasion when one of my teams were trying to bribe in all ways possible one of the team members from a different team, because she was very good at it analytically on understanding figures, and that would help them immensely. But that didn't quite work out, you know, in all fairness. But it does point to one thing, that the game supports the engagement from all parties. So if there is a member of the team which would normally, you know, a student that would normally sit in the background and sort of see the lectures and the workshops and the seminars go past them, actually they get drawn into this by their peers, and their peers actually try and force them to become more active and participative to the game itself. So it works in that respect as well.
Well, Keith, don't you go a step further as well by actually getting the teams between themselves to assign marks to each other?
Yes, this idea of social loafing, it was one of the things. This module, in one guise or another, has been in existence for probably 15 plus years. In the previous module, which I inherited, and I taught on the previous module, there was always this team element. But one of the striking features was the students participated as a team in preparing a report on a company, a well-known company like BP. But there was always a high level of disengagement within the team, and a significant number of students not submitting assessments. Sometimes it could be as high as 15%. And by changing the assessment, still keeping a team report, by using the simulation game, we found, as Alec was observing, the students seemed to continue engaging in the learning right up to the end of the trimester. So non-submission of team reports is virtually unheard of now. In fact, until this year, I don't think I'd ever had one in the last 4 or 5 years. And we've at that time run about 500 teams. So it meant that teams were, and even this year we've only had one. And I think that's more to do with COVID. So I think that the simulation game is helping to keep team members who otherwise might disengage much more engaged. So they participate in their team report as a result, but also importantly, they are now also submitting their individual report, because whilst there was a significant number of people who were not historically submitting their team report, this was then knocking on into their individual report, because I think some students thought, I've not submitted this team report, so therefore I won't bother submitting the individual report because I failed anyway, so I'll not do anything. And as a result, we've completion rate, pass rate for the module has climbed from about 83% to about 92% first attempt.
And previous to that, it was so you mentioned BP. So that was using a case study was the sort of model prior to adopting the simulation. Then really,
yes. Previously, what had been used was we would provide a list of about 100 companies, high street companies or well-known companies, and students working in teams would choose one company to analyze. They would then present on that company, but then they would go off and present as a team on that company. But then each member of the team would go off and write a report on that company. And the difficulty, as we all know with team working, is you can get social loafers. Or sometimes people it just doesn't resonate with them for whatever reason. But we find that with a simulation game, it does seem to engage students, not just to the beginning, but right through to the end of the module, in a way that just choosing well-known companies does not engage with the student. I think they see, the likes of well-known companies such as H&M or BP, although they may use their products, it's actually too distant. It doesn't really mean anything to them.
And they're not part of it, of course, as well, right?
Yeah, they're not doing part of any of the decision making.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas when a simulation game, you can see the effects of your decision. So we cut our R&D budget this week. So next week we see what the impact is in our results.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, look, we've got about, I think, 5 minutes left before we're going to go into our breakout rooms. And I want to talk a little bit about skills, if possible, if we've got enough time. But just before we do, just to say, I suppose, what we usually find, and I think, this is the case certainly with you both as well, is that the simulation will normally sit within a specific module on a program. And although that's the case, and that's the assessment within that module is directly linked to the activities within the simulation, we also find there's a range of benefits that are much wider than that. So perhaps for the program as a whole, but I mean, Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's two things that I wanted to mention. One of which is really quite relevant to the final assessment for this particular module, whereas because of the dynamics of each, although we use Foam Ventures as a main criteria for the game, because of the dynamics in each team, it actually lowers the level of plagiarism at the end and the opportunity of plagiarism within it. So that is one benefit, obviously, for each student. But also, I run concurrently another module, which is I'm running the business strategy module as well. So I I link the two modules together and make sure that the game simulation has some relevance to business strategy as well, because it is the basis of a strategic plan that we're implementing in the gamification element of this module. So the two modules, although they do run concurrently, they are very much linked into one another, and therefore it makes a lot more sense to the students once they have sat through the business strategy element, business strategy lessons, and the leadership and management lessons when they go and play the game, so they can make the connection for both sessions. Yeah.
And Keith, you've noticed those linkages a little bit as well.
Yes, I think a common feedback, a comment, often feedback is from students that playing the simulation game helps them to understand actually how the various subjects they've learned during the course of their studies, HR, finance, operations, marketing, actually all combine to either create competitive advantage or destroy competitive advantage. So things that we tend to teach in silos, and this is a historical criticism of particularly management subjects, I suppose business subjects, is we tend to teach in silos. A simulation and game gets the student to realize that actually subjects are connected. It's maybe one of the weaknesses with modularization that this silo activities so dominant, but the simulation game encourages the students to see this connectivity. And I do get a lot of feedback from students highlighting how these elements come into play and how a decision, for example, in finance impacts on operations, or a decision in HR impacts on finance. So that cause and effect becomes very understandable. So you can see both this scope of subjects that come out to play means that the student can then pick up knowledge they've acquired elsewhere and apply it to the game. It also allows them, in some cases, to be able to translate that knowledge or transfer that knowledge to their peers. So a classic one would be something like finance, which can sometimes be a difficult subject for a number of students. Students being able to explain, income statements, balance sheets, cash flows to their teammates through the simulation game. I've heard students come to me and say, hey, because of what Robbie told me, I now understand how the income and the balance statements, the cash flows are connected and why they're so valued. It just didn't make sense to me when I did it previously in the other module, but now it does make sense. I think the other thing that's stressed with simulation game is it's not just the knowledge that the students are being able to acquire and deploy, but it's the employability skills that come out in the form of leadership, oral communication, working in teams. We know that employers are constantly stressing the importance of team working to the workplace, and often is seen as kind of one of the top three skills that they demand of students. So we're saying to the students that the simulation game is about enhancing and developing these skills in a safe place. And that the consequences of developing these skills can be really progressive and positive for the individual student, both in the long term, but often we say that these ideas, they should be able to translate straight into the workplace, on a Friday evening, because so many of the students are currently working. So it's using that transferability of knowledge and skills from the workplace into the classroom, but back from the classroom / simulation game into the workplace. So you've got this kind of circular acquisition of knowledge and skills constantly being fostered and developed as you go through the module.
No, it's really good to hear, and I think I'm sure we've got a lot of sort of directors on the call today, and program leaders, associate deans, and directors of teaching and learning, and so forth. So I think it's probably really useful for some of those roles to hear about those wider benefits beyond just the module that the simulation is sitting in, and of course skills. Well, yeah, how could we have a webinar on this without talking about skills? I think for those who know us regularly and come to these webinars, we did have a specific webinar on skills earlier in the year. But I think, just to talk a little bit perhaps more on that, I think we're certainly being contacted a lot now by senior members of business schools who want to perhaps take a more strategic approach to embedding skills across all departments and all programs within the business school. And simulation seems to be a really great way to do that, not only because of the way that they're actually getting involved with the learning directly, but also because of coming back to what you both mentioned today about working in your teams and everything that goes along with it. But perhaps Alex, just some final comments on skills from you, and then we'll go into our breakout rooms.
Well, I think that the students tend to develop a lot of skills through the actual application of the theoretical elements. When they have to make decisions, they really have to think of how and what skills are going to apply to that. But I think one of the major skills that they develop is actually the ability to communicate with others that they don't know, they've possibly never have met either, because they are only going to meet them online. So it's a very difficult skill. The other skills that they do tend to develop is leadership skills. Who is going to lead who in the in that team? And they are very difficult skills to develop, especially when you're away from meeting face to face the other people. So these are some of the skills that really have come out quite loudly from this process, and I think the students have really embraced that in a way, to try and create those and enhance those skills for themselves. And we were talking about employability. The employability element is critically important, and those skills associated to employability make them a much more attractive employee or prospective employee for the industry. Definitely.
It's massively important, isn't it? And I think that's really useful. Well, we're at 11:34 now UK time, so I think it's probably good to stop this panel discussion now. But that's been really insightful and really useful, I'm sure, for all the guests. But if we go into our breakout rooms now, I'll just bring up this slide now, which is going to show us. So we've got breakout room 1 with Alex leading that one, and I'll be hosting. And then breakout 2 with Keith, and my colleague Milo will be hosting that one. If you have any questions following on today, I know it's sometimes a bit difficult to ask questions during these big sessions, but please feel free to drop us an email. You can contact me directly, or you can contact my colleagues who you've probably had some communication with around the webinar. And any questions at all are fine. Yeah, just feel free. And if anyone wants a one-to-one demo of the simulation or a one-to-one consultation to ask questions about how we can align with your module delivery, that's fine, of course, as well. Oh, it looks like the second room have finished now. Okay.
Sorry for being a little bit late. It's you know how students are, Leon.
We do indeed. Okay, all right. Well, I think everyone's back in the main room now, which is great. So it's just to say, well, we've done quite well for time today, actually. So it's bang on 12 now. So we're going to draw things to a close. If anyone has any questions following on from today, please feel free to drop us an email. You can contact me directly or any of my colleagues as well, who you've probably been in communication with around the webinar. We're happy to do one-to-one demonstrations or provide an opportunity for you to try out the simulations with your colleagues. That's absolutely fine. And if you'd like to let us see your module specifications, we're happy to analyze those for you and offer some strategies and some tips on perhaps the best way that those can fit with your modules. Really, really big thanks to our guest speakers, to Keith and Alex. It's been really useful today. So thanks so much to both of you for giving up your time today. I'm sure it's been really welcomed by all the attendees. So thanks so much to you both. Thanks also to Milo for co-hosting, and for all of the rest of the Edumundo team for supporting with today. And to all the attendees, really grateful that you could join, and please keep an eye out for the next one, which we'll be having, I'm sure, within the next couple of months. So I hope that was really useful. And that's it, webinar over. Thanks so much.
Thank you, cheers, bye-bye.